sometimes my doodlings for church are legal topics. I have diagrams that come to me during the worship service in which I analyze something. I make a picture of a legal dispute or legal problem, namely double nickel reform, which is my administrative notice project, in which I hope to overturn 100% of Tennessee jurisdictions and 100% of the white legal political establishment in Nashville and in Chattanooga, and its abuse of the poor through a misuse of the statute, an overbroad interpretation and enforcement of the statute, Title 55. A great project. Another project I'm working on is the Your Shantytown is my housing free trade zone concept, and I've got with me here in the studio a maverick guerrilla legal activist named David Alan Carmichael. He runs Freedom Ministries, which is an urban missions ministries out of Hampton, Virginia. He's 56 years old, father of 4, and he's a noted, maybe let's say a leading undocumented American. And I'm all for the undocumented American. I want it to be that we all are undocumented. Whatever the tone of our skin, whether we're white, Anglo-Saxon, Caucasians, or African American, or with oily hair and 8 children, one on the way from Honduras, fleeing gang terrorism there. And on the question, David Alan Carmichael, of the homeless problem, I've told my listener, and he maybe wants to remember now our earlier discussions on this, if you care to. And that is, we need to have a bottom of the housing market, which has been prevented from existing by regulation. And Chris Longren from Mayor in Chattanooga has done yeoman service in looking at the costs of regulation upon the housing market. We have efforts to make what's called an affordable housing sector, but that is by coercion of developers, making them, giving them a grant or a favor or a chit if they make a certain percentage of their dwellings in a block for people who can afford only $800 a month in rent. But what about the bottom of the housing market where the homeless live? David, what about negative possession? Is it possible that for my listener, if he's homeless, and I do have at least one homeless listener, to take possession of a house and live in it long enough to effectively own that property? Whoever owned it before, living in it makes it own an owner. What is the possibility of that as a development in ending the housing problem for the homeless?
Well, I've had to study that recently. There's a property that's across the street from a ministry that some of our ministers are involved in, and it's a vacant lot, and it's been vacant since 1989. The city has done some trespass on it when they bulldozed the house was on it in 2007. So what I did is I learned what is the principle of possession, what's the common law principles of taking possession, adverse possession. Every state has a different policy, or let's say a practical mechanism to secure a title to land if you do what is called adverse possession. It's based on the first commandment, be fruitful, multiply, yes, and subdue the earth, take dominion over it. So you actually, in law in America, and it is that if you use the property that it's just sitting there fallow, that you have
fallow, meaning
unused. I'm sorry.
No seeds have been sown.
Yeah. So
Okay.
you've got that property. You're using it. You're improving it. You are showing dominion. You're going to put a fence around it. It is yours. I have possession of it. You actually have property rights in that. Even if somebody else has title to it, that you demonstrate possession property rights. So right now, this property in Virginia, they're going to actually have to formally eject us from this property if the city wants it. They're going to, because we're the ones who have demonstrated possession, improvement, and things like that. And it occurred to me,
which demonstrates propriety,
yes,
which means ownership of property, right?
Yes.
You have propriety in the property because you have acted as an owner.
Yeah, and there's ways to get a title. We're looking into that. And there's certain things that you can do that. But ultimately, what it did is it showed me in the neighborhood. This isn't a poor neighborhood, a very low income area, and there's a lot of people that are homeless. And here's all these houses that have been abandoned because of the fraud that was going on with the real estate market back up to 2008 and 9. And so there's these abandoned properties that nobody's using, yet there's homeless people. Well, what the homeless person doesn't know is that you actually, under the common law, have a duty to take possession over unused property and make good things with it. You can get...
That's a common law doctrine?
Oh, absolutely. Well, yes, it is. You have to read Sir William Blackstone. Yeah. You got to read the Bible. You read Sir William Blackstone. You read the laws of England, right? And you see that you have, and I say you have a duty because of the biblical mandate, but you have a duty to take possession of this property that's abandoned, that nobody's used. It could have been, there's all kinds of weird things going on that's leaving houses abandoned right now. And you go ahead and make good with this, and you establish your presence. You get utilities, and you begin to improve and take care of that house. And there may be a time where it becomes yours. It depends on the statute of limitations. And it really is a statute of limitations. It's not like, oh, the state gives you the ability to take title. No, it's that you possessed it so long that the statute of limitations has been exceeded and no court has jurisdiction to eject you. And that's the principle behind it. So it's old school understandings of law. It's not loopholes. It's not trickery. It's actually based on a biblical mandate.
And these properties often are owned by cities which seize them in back tax sales and have no use for them. Really can't sell them.
Actually, what I discovered is the city wasn't doing that. They bulldozed the house because they called it a nuisance. However, they didn't exercise eminent domain. What they were supposed to do is what they call it, escheat the property, where there's one lawyer it's a common law function where he escheats the property back for the king, and he makes all the full public notice, and then the city would have to sue this escheator to take possession of the property or to take it for purposes of eminent domain.
To bulldoze the property.
But nonetheless, they actually have to pay whoever the titled people or their heirs for the value of the property. So they're not doing that. What they're doing is trespassing on the property and then kind of setting it up for somebody who's rich and powerful to come in and essentially exercise adverse possession, or in one way or the other. So in most cases, I'm seeing that the cities aren't exercising their eminent domain obligations.
In San Diego, David Alan Carmichael, and elsewhere, there are growing numbers of homeless people. It's a crisis there. Here we have 700 or 800, and I've proposed that we have effectively a shanty town, that the city map out undesirable areas that it owns, and square it all up and tell homeless people, if you live on this land 2.5 years, we will give you legal title to this 80 by 40 block next to other blocks of the same size. We just divide it out. And you live there, but you have to have a residency, and you have to establish it there, which means that they build a shack with tarps, cast off lumber, you name it. They build it and they stay there. Eventually, the good ones will, they'll help the others, and you have a little marketplace there. And outside of regulation, David Alan Carmichael, creates the homeless crisis. It prevents the bottom of the housing market, where the homeless people who have no incomes live. And you're suggesting there be is it called adverse possession?
It's just basically that's what houses. And I want to tell you, in California, people are so confused because there's homeless people with property rights. And there's fences that the police put up right now. And I just came from California. I was hearing it from the locals and seeing it. There's certain places I would go to as my favorite spots. There's essentially shanty towns. And I think what's happened is some smart homeless person has sued a police officer who messed with their stuff, because you don't have any authority to mess with somebody's property. And they've established a location. Jim, Joe, Mary, and everybody know that that's Peter's zone. And they don't mess with Peter's zone. So why do you, the police officer, do it? So they're actually exercising common law rights in their establishing a spot. And it's confusing people. They don't understand how that could happen. But if you go back to the principles of law, you understand that they've exercised adverse possession. Principles of law are things that David Alan Carmichael is very well versed in. He is a pro se litigant. He's a guerrilla legal activist. And one of his great notes to fame is that he is an undocumented American. David, you're a former submariner, a Navy man. You are 56 years old, father of 4, a Christian minister living in Hampton, Virginia, and a husband for 33 years, and a husband to a lovely wife for 33 years. Sorry, she doesn't want to be mentioned on the radio. Now, tell my listener how it is you came. We have just a couple minutes left. Tell my listener how you came into this struggle over the Social Security number. And here's the question the listener wants me to ask you, David Alan Carmichael. Is having a Social Security number voluntary? And if it is, why would we want to have one? Well, I came to it because of religious convictions. Let's just tell you, if you've read the book of Revelation, they describe this number in there. And there's actually a reward for those who overcome a number. So what is this number? And I just could not in good conscience keep playing with this number that you're required to do everything with without, even though it's not a Social Security benefit. So I happened to be a chief petty officer in the Navy when that happened. And I actually had to get rid of my number and then have the Navy issue a Navy generated service number. A long story there. What I want to do is answer your question without going into the details of that. But what I had to do is I had to figure out, how do I obey the edicts of God and the edicts of men? And so I studied and found that the Social Security number has to be voluntary as a matter of law. But of course, also I went to the Social Security Administration, and in my initial trying to do some homework, I asked, hey, what does the law say? At what point do my children have to have a Social Security number? And the lady said, there is no law. It is completely voluntary. You're kidding. And then I said, it was logical. I said, well, how do I unvolunteer? She says, you can't. So that was a little bit sublime, gross. Just, I hated that thought, but it can't be right. You can't have something that's voluntary and then unvolunteer if you've never been volunteered.
What briefly did you do to unvolunteer yourself from the machine?
I drafted a letter to the Commissioner of Social Security, give notice, and said that something had been done in the past. It was fraud and error. My mother didn't know what she was doing, so she didn't understand the ramifications. So I found out in study of law that I have 2 years from the time of discovering an error to give notice and publish and separate myself from that.
Is that process called rescission, to rescind?
Some people call that. That's effectively what it was, is I rescinded the application.
Right. You can't rescind the number, only the application done against you and against your interest. Now that you're of maturity, you're a grown man. That was done when you were a minor.
Right. So it was done as I was a minor, so I rescinded it. Now it turned out, I found out years later, they have 10 days to reply to a records change request. And they just, at my case, they ignored my correspondence. There's other people that they don't ignore their correspondence. I guess whoever's at the desk that day, and they actually suppress the record. And I know people whose record has been completely suppressed by the Social Security Administration, and they didn't respond to my request. I didn't know the details. I could have sued them on that for money. It's a long story. You have to look it up. But the point was, I knew in good faith from this point on, and I promised in my rescission letter that I will never identify with it again, henceforth.
Or claim any of the benefits or the aura of benefits.
Right.
There's a kind of a holy sheen that surrounds the number that are your protections, right?
Yeah, like when you send your kids to college, the first thing you got to do is fill out the FAFSA. The free application for student financial aid, right? And I've had to war against colleges. You can't register without doing that. Of course, I registered my kids for college. They registered without the number and without the FAFSA. But it's every step of the way. It's a fight. It's a fight. So I came to the understanding, and it took me about 2 years to do some study at the law, that I understood I could not in good conscience continue with that number. So that's when I sent in that letter. It was just under the 2 years before I got this hunkering for being unnumbered. And again, I was in the Navy, and I asked them for the accommodation, and they did not entertain the accommodation. I was ejected from the Navy without due process.
On what grounds?
They said I didn't voluntarily sign the reenlistment document. There was an affidavit of hard obliserve, they call it, that I could not sign. So I gave a oath in lieu of it in front of witnesses. And the next word that came out of the chief warrant officer's mouth was discharge him. Well, under the circumstance, it should have gone to the Secretary of the Navy, not a chief warrant officer. So, and there was a provision in both the pay manual to have a pseudo SSN, that's just a Navy generated SSN. And there was also a provision of a religious accommodation instruction that was supposed to be followed, up to the point of even having the Secretary of the Secretary of the Navy reviewing my request and see if it was practical, if it fulfilled, basically military mission. If it's not going to offend the military mission, then it should have been accommodated. Okay, so that's how I came to the place. I came to a conviction of living without the number. It cost me everything. It cost me my career. It cost me my marital bliss. It cost me my reputation.
How did it cost you marital bliss, David?
Oh, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but women have this natural bent toward nurturing their children and having security, and if your husband loves his wife, he's going to be a good provider. Guess what? although it's supposedly voluntary, how do you get a job without this number? Yeah, it's practically impossible, notwithstanding that it's legally protected. But nobody knows that. And so you can't get a job. You can't get a bank account. You can't cash checks.
Well, you can't have employment.
Can't have employment.
You can have a job, but not employment, which is federally regulated.
Right. And so, it was a challenge. I do contracts for somebody. They don't want to pay me till they give me a number. Some of them refused. I had the state of Virginia refused to pay me unless I got a number until I wrote a letter to the Attorney General of Virginia, and they told this school that was a government school to pay me for teaching classes that I had done. So, it's a strange struggle, but it was and it affirmed that I was doing the right thing, because everything didn't make sense. Everything they were doing was stupid. Why? This is not a benefit of Social Security. What's the problem? You can take out taxes, send it to the Treasury Department. So what's the problem? There's accommodation written here. So what's the problem? Why are you so hell-bent on forcing me to identify as an element of my identity this number? And of course, my children have driver's licenses because they never had a number, but because they said, because you've had a number in the past.
And in Tennessee, because of my case, David Alan Carmichael, my listener, if his children don't have SSNs, they can get a driver's license without one. They just have to sign an affidavit that they've never been issued one. And that came from the David Toulis case in the early 2000s.
And I appreciate it. It's now a formal 2007 publication by the Social Security Administration, my friend, that tells states that very thing. So, and again, I've done some things that help people get their kids' driver's license in Virginia. You've done that's influence. And right now, I'm currently communicating with the federal agencies to try to get them to publish that those who have ever had a number in the past, if they have, especially of the religious conviction, that they also can be treated like the unnumbered. There's no reason why Section 666 of the Federal Welfare Code that's mandating states ask for this number. There's no reason why it would be stronger than laws protecting religion.
Well, you make it sound so simple, David Alan Carmichael, and you make it sound that, well, the federal government really is reasonable. It's just making a few little mistakes along the margins where you are, and you hope to change things. Is that really the case, or is the system just dead set against anybody who's independent and undocumented, whether he's a Caucasian, as you are, or a Hispanic or a Black person?
I think, just observing it, experiencing it for 20 years, that it's the latter. That there is a sublime motivation that is anti-man. In fact, I think it's satanic. Ultimately, it's putting another God, a fake God, before our eyes and our submission and our dependency, rather than the living God who's promised to take care of it. So we seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Those things will be added on top. All those things that we worship the state that issues that number because we're counting on it to look after us in our old age. We don't trust our children to rear us and care for us when we're old. We count only on Social Security to do so and mass corporate institutions. And I'm in a situation where ultimately, if my children don't step up, then there's going to be physical suffering. I've told my children to step up. And we'll see what they do.
What do you mean?
In other words, honor your father and mother in their old age. You're supposed to be caring for them, just as we care for you as you're a child. As we become a child in our later days, you're going to be caring for us. And so we'll see what happens. Other than that, they're pretty obedient children, the four of them.
And what are their age ranges?
So the youngest now is 19, going to be 20 in November. The oldest is 30.
David Alan Carmichael is an undocumented American, no SSN, and he travels freely on the road and exercises rights that very few people know about. But David, I know my listener, he hasn't met people like you, and that's why I'm so glad you're able to join us today. My listener doesn't have to do what you've done or what I've done, but I think what I want my listener to do here at Nougat Radio is just to appreciate people like you and to pray for them, because there are many people who are outside the system whom we never see. They're poor working people. They work on farm gangs. They're on the margins of society. They're often very poor. They don't speak the language. They're ignorant of the laws. They live in fear, and you in a way represent them, David.
Well, that's true. And we were talking earlier about my friend John, who's in a court right now. Is that he represents the little guy. He stood up and told the police officer, no, you can't interrogate me. I'm going to be quiet. I'm not going to answer your questions. You're going to let me go, or you're going to put me in jail, and then I'm going to sue you. So he's representing the little guy, because who else is going to fight that battle?
the man who stands up for himself needs to understand that he's not doing it just for himself. If he's doing it in the principles of liberty and fear of God, he represents. And I would say John in Farmville, Virginia, is doing that this morning, right now. And David Alan Carmichael, you're doing that too. And this is David Toulis. I do thank you for tuning into our show today. David Alan Carmichael, thanks for joining us. Thank you. We are sponsored by some wonderful advertisers here at Big Radio 927. Your treat, and we're the South number 308-989-4389. The website for the men and women who matter. And now, our sponsors, great people, wonderful people here in Chattanooga. Do patronize their business and realize that we're supported by them. You support them.
3, 2, 1.
Chattanooga Radio, Digital FM